First of all, let me say thank you very much to all three of our speakers. And I think that they've given us a lot to think about. The volunteers will come around and collect questions that you have on the cards, and they'll bring them up to me. They've got, and when they're done with that, the microphones will be available. One of them over there. There we go. And so again, let me thank the speakers, and perhaps as we're collecting questions from the audience, let me take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first, but also to invite each of you, if you have questions of the others, to please let me know, and we can facilitate that as well. You don't just have to answer questions; you can ask them as well. So I wanted to begin by talking about a topic that a couple of you touched on. The Twin Cities has a fairly sizable immigrant population and immigrant populations. And in this political environment, and in fact, one of you also mentioned that the issue of safety is much more than just crime and reactions to crime. And so putting those two observations together, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this, about safety when it comes to immigrant groups in the year 2017.
Okay. I can start. When we think about what that looks like on a daily basis, let us not forget that our families who have children in school are making arrangements, and many of those schools are also preparing to safeguard their children in terms of having compacts and policies as to whether or not ICE is able to come in and intervene and take those children. We look at the fact that, as I said earlier, our children are wondering, will their loved one be home when they come home? Will they be deported while they're at school? We're looking at the fact that many of our families have multi-status citizenship or lack thereof in their families. So one might be a citizen, one might be a green card holder, one might be undocumented. At any point in time, they will have three different trajectories. We heard this morning with the Mexican consulate in St. Paul in a report saying that the uptick on having dual citizenship for Mexican nationals has gone up exponentially since the start of the year, which is to say that these are U.S.-born children whose parents might be undocumented who are now seeking then dual citizenship for their U.S.-born children so that they will have Mexican citizenship and U.S. citizenship, so that if the parents should be deported, the children can then enter Mexico with status. These are all preparation plans that are happening and are necessary and must occur, largely speaking, invisible to mainstream community unless mainstream has their radar up on those. It really is terroristic to think that you are at any point in time vulnerable to an immigration raid. And irrespective of what you think about our immigration policies, I think we all can agree that when children are living in fear, that's terrorism. When communities are living in fear, that's terrorism. And then our refugee families who are also torn and separated by recent policies by our government about not allowing them to come in as well. Refugees, by definition, are fleeing. They're fleeing persecution. They're fleeing danger. And I think the recent accounts of what we've seen in the last 24 hours and beyond that certainly puts in perspective the amount of fear that is occurring among immigrant and refugee communities.
So I'd like to add in just real quickly, about a month ago, I'd say, my organization adopted a slight shift in our agenda, and we expanded it to include 4 words: resist, defend, advance, and innovate. And we felt the need to express this specifically because we want to be able to stand together and stand up for moving forward and advancing and innovating the things that we believe and have experienced are working in our society. But we also recognize the need to protect each other and to stand against and speak out against oppressive and unjust practices. So on the issue particularly of intimidation, threat, arrest, deportation, and the attacks against immigrants, I think there's such a spectrum. It's unfortunate, the state action and the political and police action, and then there's also the hate activity that's expanding, and that activity isn't always even perpetrated against people who are not here lawfully. There are lots of folks just because of their appearance, because of their dress, because of their faith, because of their speech, who are all lumped together, and you see sometimes the ignorance that goes along with that, folks not even knowing what your culture is and assuming and then taking action and violence. But the other thing that I think we've been very focused upon is understanding this concept of sanctuary. There are lots of cities across the country who are declaring themselves to be sanctuaries, and whether the term sanctuary city is the right term, whether it has lawful composition to it, the notion and the intent to be able to identify a goal that a community wants to stand against the notion of terrorism and attack and stand for the notion of protection is something that we're exploring, including the concept not just of sanctuary, quote-unquote, cities, but sanctuaries in our communities, like hospitals, like schools, like universities, and churches. And this is, I think, exactly what builds upon what you're talking about, that fear that's being engendered, and I think deliberately so, of creating a level of stress in families that they're going to be wrested apart, that you can't go out, you can't go to work, you can't be on public transportation because of something that might happen. And what that ultimately does, it is, I think, a form of terrorism, but it's also a form of silencing people's voice. When you think about the impact that the Dreamers movement was beginning to have, not just for the young people that wanted to come out of the shadows and finish their educations and have an opportunity to work, but just the notion of youth speaking up to say they wanted a voice in our policy as a nation. This type of activity, it seems to me, is a way to try to intimidate and silence that. So all of these are examples of fear, but I think there are also examples of places where folks don't just have to accept it. We do need to defend, but we also need to innovate and come up with ways to find a different path.
We've had a request from the back to lean into the microphone a little bit.
I'll lean in.
Lean in.
So, you know, I don't have a lot to add, but I have a story to share, which is we had our all-staff meeting in the agency a few weeks back, and I provided time to listen, and one of our staff members stood up and said that he was so fearful of what was going to happen that he sent his children to go live out of the country with family members because he didn't want his kids here for the next 4 years. It took everything I had to keep it together. And so these are the types of choices that people are faced with. And it's not just about people coming in the door. It is the fear of what's happening around that issue on top of it that's compounding it. And as a parent, he should never, him and his family should never have to make that choice. It's completely unacceptable.
I'll just underscore the trauma in this. You know, I spoke about it earlier. Just think about the level of toxic stress that our children and our families are facing every day. I mean, that's the humanity behind all of this. When we talk about what that looks like, think about living in fear 24/7. It'll eat you up.
Got a lot of very good questions on these cards. Let me move to the next one. If you could influence CEOs of large companies in your city, what would you ask them to do in support of healthy and safe communities?
My response would be...
Run that grocery store.
Well, yeah, support my grocery store. It would be to provide resources and allow us to do the work. That there's sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen, and that that there is this drive for business to drive these impacts, and the way that we're approaching this work are like the people in community are little widgets, and that everything is going to work the same way for everyone. And so while I am deeply grateful, I do think that we have to find funds to support innovative solutions that have some flexibility and nimbleness around it, and maintain high expectations for what we say we're going to do. That's what I would say.
I don't think we have enough time for my list, but I'll start. I would start with, again, a systemic barrier. One example would be the hiring practices for some corporations, which is along the lines of, I'll start with name bias. And there's studies on this, that an African-American sounding name, like Lakeisha or Jamal, has a lower rate of hire than a John or a Mary or a Jeremy. That's implicit bias. And that's, if our applicants of color can't even get their foot in to have an interview in these corporations, then all that we talked about in terms of a high quality education is all for naught. We are then underutilizing our talent within communities of color to get them in. And I have personal experience of this with a daughter of mine. I wrote an op-ed about this about a year or two ago. When we talk about changing those practices, it really is internally, and making sure that those practices are systematized from within, and making sure that we are able to see those differences and hold those hiring practices accountable. When we look at how that relates then to everything else that we talk about building families who are healthy. And we can't be healthy unless we have those opportunities for full and maximum employment. That's one idea.
So I would agree with both of those issues and both of those recommendations, and add a couple of others. First and foremost, I want corporations and us to understand that policymakers aren't just public policymakers. Private policymakers have an enormous effect on our lives. And so in the same way that we've been challenging the public sector to address our communities with enhanced levels of equity, I would want to see CEOs of top corporations do the same thing. And I absolutely agree with the issue of hiring practices and procurement practices too. It's the vendors that they interact with and the small businesses that they support. But there's a way in which corporations handle their business, we'll put it that way, where just at any level they put profit over people. And so when you think about it, and I could do this riff on food corporations, but let me just talk back about years ago when car makers were asked to put seatbelts into cars and spent years resisting it. It was impossible, it was unnecessary, it was too expensive, they couldn't retool, they couldn't refit, blah, 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 and we all have seatbelts in our cars. And it took so long, and so many people died in the interim, really because of that sort of obstinate, why should we have to? They spend more money fighting the regulation than they did actually retrofitting, and the lives saved and the contribution to our economy that was as a result of lives being saved is exponential. So it was that examining your practices, examining the impacts of your products and your services on the lives of people who've been so harmed in the past. Sugar sweetened beverages, we could just go on and on and on. There's lots of different ways for us to do things instead of in this adversarial way. And the second thing I'd say is we have so many industries now, some of the most economically viable and profitable industries that are based on innovation and social enterprise, the tech economy, those sorts of things. And yet that is almost exclusively a white male club, despite the fact that as many innovative ideas come out of people that look like this room, that look like this city, that look like people from all over the world. It is to broaden their perspective, whether you're talking about the entertainment industry or the tech industry, to say, let's look at, if you're only talking to the people that you talk to, then that's the only people that you're ever going to appeal to. Let's broaden that perspective and look differently at all that's around us, and we bet that you'll not get just good ideas, but more good ideas.
So there's a couple of questions here that are kind of similar in the sense that they identify particular groups and ask for your reactions about ways to support health and safety. There's a question about what about First Americans? There's a question about the most rapidly growing population in Minnesota and the U.S., the aging community. And then there's a question about despite the legal advances, the concerns that the LGBTQ community can have about safety and health. And so I would offer that sort of as a group to you and ask for your reactions to those types of questions.
Want to start?
So I think safe communities have to be safe for everyone, and that we have to recognize the issues, the challenges, the disparities, the resistance that are happening, that everyone is facing. And I don't know if I know completely how to answer that other than being aware and continuing to be on a journey of learning how I can do that work better. So for First Americans, what I heard when the travel ban, the immigration ban first happened was people saying, well, we're all immigrants. We were all immigrants at some point. And so then what happened is Native Americans, people, no. You got your history wrong. And if we're going to have equity and be inclusive, then how can we be saying that and exclude me? Then we got into the Ben Carson thing about African-American slaves being immigrants and slaves coming over in slave boats. And it's like, no, Africans were in boats and they became slaves when they got here. They weren't, so I think that when we understand what's happened historically, we can better define what the issue is that we're facing without becoming a problem. Like, we can't move towards inclusive community by excluding other people in the process. And so I think we just have to be more mindful of how we're saying things. And when people say, that didn't include me, to not feel attacked, but to figure out how we can do better.
I would add that, unfortunately, historically, the way our conversations have gone in our country along race and ethnicity and origin has been a binary approach, which is literally it's black or white. And anything in between or before that isn't even mentioned or isn't even counted. And I have many friends, dear friends, from the American Indian community who, when we talk, they're constantly being told that they're statistically insignificant, such that the data is not even collected nor reported on them. So you talk about not being respected, so much so that you're not even being counted, literally, in many of the studies or even mentioned. And we know that in Minnesota we have 11 reservations. We have one of the largest, if not the largest, urban American Indian population in the country. Many of our immigrant communities are indigenous as well, and have indigenous communities in their own home countries. African Americans before you were enslaved and brought over were indigenous and tribal in their own. So there's a commonality among our people that really unites us. And we think about the power that comes from that and being able to do that together. My Asian American friends will often comment about how they are tired and exhausted about living up to being the model minority and having to live up to that, and all the stereotypes that come within that, and the pressure that comes with that as well, and how exponentially their they're growing so rapidly, but the media is not paying attention to them. And the LGBTQI community as well, while made quite a bit of progress over time, so much more to do, particularly with the trans community. What I look at among all of these issues, and I think just embedded in that question, is the power of all of us uniting. I think the mainstream community, those in power, those who are focused on othering us, as John Paul says so eloquently, count on us not being together. Count on us on not working together. To the adage of united we stand, divided we fall. When we all work together towards equity, towards inclusion, we will win. We will be victorious. We will succeed. But when the system is designed to pit us against each other, low-income white folks who historically aligned with slaves, were told back in Jim Crow days that they had a different role to take because slave owners were fearful that the two would then unite and have an uprising against those in power. So history has taught us a lot. We just need to pay attention.
History has taught us a lot, and I think they've taught us that the people who would benefit from the status quo will work very hard to keep us away from each other. And I think there have always been examples of activists and particularly cultures sharing and learning from each other. A lot of alliances made throughout our history of indigenous people, African Americans, as the country was acquired from Mexico, relationships formed that weren't as rigidly defined as we've defined them now, and yet I think that separation was exploited for the gain of others. So on the one hand, it's incumbent upon us to learn about our other cultures, to learn about the history, learn about how any of us have survived some of the onslaught of oppression or terrorism or genocide or whatever the terms are that you want to use. All of them apply, frankly. That we've managed to survive, to thrive, to keep our cultures intact, and we do have many, many things in common, whether it's food practices, religious practices, interactions with nature. But I also don't want us to dilute them all. I think that the beauty is the fabric that is so rich when you are able to respect and honor other people's tradition and not try to make everything exactly the same. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier in all of our presentations when we talked about listening and fostering leadership of those communities that have been marginalized by whether it's society or media or whatever the form is, because there is such power, there is such strength and survival in those cultures. Having said that, I think those are also the building blocks of being able to define what health and safety is, because as I said earlier, if you define health for somebody, you might be getting them into a practice that is absolutely abhorrent to them. And on the framework of and I'm thinking about all the things that just happened with the pipeline issues and what some people thought was beneficial and profitable and economically viable, and others thought, well, it's an environmental threat, and others thought, and it's our heritage, and it is our culture, and it is the significance of land to our society. So this is sort of the origin story of the U.S., pushing people off land, telling them how to live, and I think our First Peoples or Native peoples, as well as people of color that have followed from various parts of the world, have unfortunately run into very similar experiences, and we can learn a lot from each other about how we can overcome those. But I want to say real quickly on this notion of seniors, and maybe it's because I'm one. The spirit and the power and the impact that I see from youth advocating, organizing, and this might relate a little bit to the broadening understanding and political recognition of the rights of the LGBT community, where I think younger folks, not just youth, not just teens, but younger folks have been much more comfortable and supportive of and acknowledging of everybody's ability to live their lives and love who they want and live how they want. And so I think we have sometimes this generational divide, and yet we have seniors who have tremendous needs when it comes to issues of economic stability and health care and just the quality of their lives in later years. I think about the level of homelessness among seniors and the level of homelessness among senior veterans, and just so many different categories. At the same time, seniors are typically stereotyped to be the most politically active because they vote. They don't necessarily have as much involvement in some of the other political decision-making, though. And so what I'd like to make the pitch for, and it relates, I think, to some of the gender and sexuality issues, as well as the questions of age, and all the cultural issues and racial issues we've raised, and that is the intersectionality of all of this. We almost all belong to multiple categories, and we can recognize that I'm a woman, I also am a woman of color, and I'm also a senior. And those kinds of things could show us that we have a way to work on multiple platforms rather than to say, I'm going to line up with this group and I'm not going to listen to or care about the issues of others. So I think that the theme for all of us has been this question of being able to be strong and true in the things that you believe about, but be able to join in coalition and collaboration with others to have that power and to have that strength.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you and acknowledge the supreme dedication that you have, and I'm certain endless hours, 25-hour days, and so on, that you've all provided to your respective populations. But what I wanted to ensure was that we don't promote future discrimination simply by terms. And the term that I'm talking about is people of color. American Indians and Alaska Natives, as what's stated in numerous federal statutes, occasionally the term Native American is used, but we are not a racial group. We are a political group. We have a government-to-government relationship directly with the federal government in the Constitution as dependent nations, domestic dependent nations. And so in Indian country, which is mostly rural, whenever the term people of color is used, we're like, oh, well, okay, go ahead, because that doesn't include us. And then secondly, and this is improving a bit, it used to be like a minority conference. We're not a minority either because we are a political group. And personally, I can never call another human being a minority. I just can't do it. And so anything that degrades and excludes, there's over 200 rancherias in the state of California and bands of American Indians that have similar attitudes. Our population shifted. Now 70% of all American Indians live in urban America. Understanding that an individual can be referred to however they want to be, and I would gladly do that. But generally speaking, the term people of color alienates us. And that's not right. And secondly, it hurts our political relations to get people to understand and listen. We deal directly with the federal government, not even the state government. But this state has consulted with tribes for a number of years, and we fought hard back in the mid-90s. And in legislation, at least in the health legislation, it is all reported as people of color and American Indians. And there's a new bill that's on the floor right now that is people of color and indigenous populations, and that's okay too. But we are not a racial group. And just so folks understand that, we don't think we're any better than anybody else. And I can tell you horror stories about how my ancestors survived. We want to work on assets. We want to know, we know the disparities, and equity will acknowledge that. But equity also allows us to figure out, how did we get here? I mean, just horror stories of what happened. My ancestors were taught, they dug holes in the woods. Now, this is in Cherokee, North Carolina. So whenever the soldiers came to steal the babies and the kids to put them in residential school, those kids ran into the woods, got in the hole, and covered themselves with leaves. Now, I just don't know how much sadder you can get.
So can I say that I certainly appreciate the clarification and the comment, both from the perspective of language and really to underscore how important it is for people to name themselves and name their community. We have all kinds of governmental language and bureaucratic speak and acronyms and things like that, but it's always important to listen to and then try to make adjustments in order to make the most inclusive approach possible, and recognize that because something was a term one day or 1 year, it's going to change, and people's understanding and their comfort and their own identity is going to be stronger. And so we always, I think, I can't speak for anybody else, I welcome the correction, the clarification, and particularly the examples and the applications, because again, I think that's how we figure out a way to move forward in a position of strength. And I also really appreciate the comment on disparity analysis as opposed to whether it's assets or equity analysis, because we do need to understand how we got here, but we also need to understand where we want to get, which is again, that is a self-determination piece as well. And I've been wanting to say this the whole time, I keep forgetting, that even the word safety, when I thought about it in terms of these remarks and making a preparation, it's safety for, even that word can be used to be so separate. So is it safety from us or safety for us? And you were talking about that, Samjana, the question of we feeling safe in our own communities, or the quote-unquote mainstream society, the affluent society, or the business community feeling safe from. And so sometimes the militarization or the distance is put away to make the folks in power feel safe, which has done nothing other than exacerbate the lack of safety for folks in their own communities.
And the othering.
And the othering.
Yeah.
Another question. Thank you very much. I heard it said that public health is not a partisan issue and equity shouldn't hinge on what party is in charge or who is president. But the reality is many people don't consider something to be a public health issue worth considering until it affects the white community. How do we change that?
Yeah, we have a minute left. We can address that.
You know, I was at a conference last week. We had about over 1,400 race equity, diversity and inclusion folks. And a similar question came up, which was stop using the word diversity. Because according to studies, when you use the word diversity, that a large segment of our society, so pretty much folks who are white, particularly white men, feel excluded. And in the workplace, where it's, you know, those in power are of that demographic, then we're not going to make any advances. And that was what the speaker was talking about, at least, and that was her point. And as she tried to launch into the importance of using inclusion, all the hands of people of color just raised up, you know, and just said, wait a minute, you know. So now we have to retrench from using a particular approach because it offends somebody and it excludes them. And there was a really healthy discussion to it. And I bet if we open that up right now, we would probably have an equally healthy discussion about that as well. And I think when we look at this, my take on this, and it's one approach of many, is that's why it's important to have people in leadership positions that have different lived experiences. And those lived experiences are not dictated by your race or ethnicity or your national origin or indigenous origin. And it's what those lived experiences are, because our lived experiences define what we prioritize. And when you think about it that way, we begin to start learning from one another in different ways, and you have a different conversation that can then lead you to understand a situation differently. When you look at who your go-to people are, say in the business sector, one of the critiques is that if your go-to list of 10 people look like you and have the exact same background as you, then you're not learning anything new. You're stuck within your own bubble. So it's about injecting different experiences, folks who have lived experiences that are other than your own, that we can begin to at least chip away. I think it's a heck of a panacea to think that we're going to do this in one fell swoop. But if enough of those lived experiences are different than your own, then you can begin to see things differently. I'm big on quotes, and I shared one earlier. I'll share one now in Spanish, and I'll tell you what it means afterwards. Cada cabeza es un mundo. Every mind, it's a world in and of itself. A mind and a world of different interpretations, of different possibilities, different ideas and contributions. So the word diversity in my mind is that. It's not really based on necessarily and restricted to your skin color or your ethnicity or your origin. It really is about your different way of thinking and contributions.
Yeah. I wrote down worldview, so I think that's really interesting. I also think it's important not to feel victim to, but to feel inspired towards something. I think that we need to have more people that care about these issues running for office, electing people whose values line up with the community. I think that we're organizing in a much different way, and if we're not now, we will, because I think we understand the importance of local politics and the impact on communities. I also, sometimes will laugh, and people, when you're in tune and you understand what inclusive places and spaces look and feel like, you pick up on language, and so some will describe diversity just as you said it, where it includes all types of diversity in terms of experiences and age and all the things that go with it. Some will describe it by who's in the room, right? So you'll have something and want to make sure that they have diversity represented or diversity represented on their board, right? And I've been in conversations where I'm like, this is not like Noah's Ark, right? Like you don't need two of everyone to prove that you're in tune, right? Because if that's how you're thinking about it, then you were starting from the wrong place. But if you were thinking about what is the best experience I can give the people that will be there, what is the most diverse experience I can provide that is in the realm of my influence, and if you're thinking about that, then you're going to have a diverse group of people with a diverse group of worldviews that you will be thinking about in order to accomplish that. And I just, I have to get to the point of saying, I get that there's lots and lots of challenges, but there's so many opportunities for us to make change. And we've seen it over and over again where a small group will get determined and make some significant change, and especially at the local level.
So I'm going to try to take this in a slightly global direction. You were starting to talk about global. And if the question is, how do we get decision makers, policy makers, and I'll say both public and private, to act beyond just their own personal interest, if it's a question of white health being the only thing that's important, I'd say that, unfortunately, one of the ways to, or probably the only way that we're going to be able to really make change is to demonstrate, for people to experience how that won't work. It's not working now, and it's going to get worse. And on that doomsday note, for many of us that have worked in nonprofits for a long time or in philanthropy, there's been a real interest in evidence. Everyone wants evidence-based planning and investment, and so there's lots of data that's available to us now that years ago you couldn't get your hands on. We were making maps. I was talking before about the alcohol outlet issue in South Los Angeles, and what we did years ago to demonstrate to policymakers that there were too many of them really came from community residents telling us that. And some of us were activists, and we said, well, we'd sort of forgotten. They disappeared into the landscape. They were so common. So we mapped them. But we didn't have GIS mapping, so we put a big brown piece of paper that went the whole length of a wall, and we drew a city street on it, a particular corridor in South Los Angeles. And every time there was a liquor store on the street, we put a push pin in. And then the other two uses that were very common on that street and in the community were hourly motels where people could rent by the hour, because you want to freshen up real quickly on your way to work, and also churches, storefront churches. So every time there was actually they didn't use a push pin. I'm sorry, we used a little drawing that we made. So we put a bottle on the map for every liquor store, a cross on the map for every church, and a bed on the map for every motel. And the map looked like every intersection, a cluster, bottle, 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 church, or cross, bottle, bed, bottle, cross, bottle, 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 bottle. Just so many bottles. It made such a big impact on us. But we didn't have the tools to show that. Now you could do a data run and just press a button and all that will come up in different colors. And instead of having to cut out little bottles with brown paper, we could just do a little scan from the computer. The point that I'm making, though, is that evidence alone, data alone, is not what it's going to take. We weren't able to convince everybody with the data because we have it. We've been having it. We can take you to it. We can show it to you. We can create an audio file, anything you want to show the depth of disparities. And morality hasn't worked because it's obvious how wrong this is. It's obvious when we hear stories of how people have been oppressed and mistreated and horrific examples throughout our history, and yet that hasn't changed. And so now I think we're trying to use an economic argument. That's why PolicyLink has our National Equity Atlas, because we're trying to show people that equity is a economic driver. It's more functional, it's more profitable, and the converse is true, that inequity is extraordinarily expensive. But we'll also tell you that it isn't just the individuals that suffer from health challenges because they're people of color, it's the rest of us too. And so that message, if we can try and tell it to you in a nice, objective, academic, dispassionate way, or we can live it. And we can live it in what will result in our society, which has unfortunately been too many examples in our history to show what that looks like. So, I don't want to end my remarks on such a negative point, but I have to tell people that when I say that there's an urgency, when I say that there's an imperative, when I say that this is reaching crisis proportions, it's because it is. And when I also say that the best news is that we have so much opportunity to do it differently. The best news is that we can make this a society, whether it's here in Minneapolis, regionally, nationally, where we learn from our past, our sordid past, and we build a future where everybody is participating and including and having an opportunity to prosper. And it's not going to be as hard as we think. I think it's up here that it's harder than it is when we really put our effort into it.
Thank you very much. We are unfortunately more than out of time, but I appreciate your efforts. I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking the speakers. And we will conclude on that optimistic note. I appreciate it. I would like to, in addition to thanking the speakers, thank the volunteers, thank the event planners, to note that there is an evaluation sheet in your materials. Invite you to fill that out and hand it to the volunteer at the door on your way out. If you are seeking continuing education credits, the program has the description of the next steps to take, and with that, I think we can conclude today's presentations. Thank you.